A lot of Americans don't know enough about politics to have a coherent political ideology, and many are just too lazy to bother to inform themselves to form one. So as a result, we end up with an electorate that makes decisions based mostly on vibes as opposed to actual policies, which is the whole point of politics. And because of this, we often get a lot of wave riders who jump on bandwagons and change their beliefs based on cultural trends or electoral outcomes, which then leads to pundits, celebrities, and corporations changing with the culture in order to stay relevant. For example, during the George Floyd protests back in 2020, corporations like Target tried to become more sensitive to racial justice issues and adopted DEI policies as a result. But after Donald Trump's victory in 2024, they sensed that the public kind of soured on racial justice issues and dropped their DEI program. But just months later, the trend is already reversing again, and after losing money due to boycotts since they dropped their DEI program, Target's CEO Brian Cornell requested a meeting with Al Sharpton to signal his openness potentially to reverse the reversal of their DEI policy. Back and forth, back and forth. It's a microcosm of what happens broadly in the United States. And just to kind of give you all a sense of where we're going, in 2028, we'll all be woke SJWs with septum piercings and blue hair, but by 2032, we're scheduled to be fascist again, so we'll take out our septum rings and put on the camo and start saying slurs again. But I've got to say, the worst offenders of this vibes-based politics, which I hate, who leaned a little bit too hard into the opposite direction once things changed, has got to be so-called comedians. Not all of them, but a lot of them. See, when you're filthy rich and all of your material needs are met, you've got to make up things to be mad about to give your life purpose. For a lot of these comedians, the woke mind virus is their biggest boogeyman because it gives them permission to believe that people aren't laughing at their jokes, not because they're washed up or unfunny or out of touch, but because people just get offended too easily these days. So for someone like Bill Maher, for example, slaying the woke beast becomes your entire life purpose. It becomes your biggest political issue because, you know, that's the way that you can reclaim your former glory. And since there's nothing else to care about for you, since you already won the game of capitalism, you've got to have something be your little pet project, so why not make it that? So, you know, they start punching left, and eventually they start to fash max in order to cultivate a following of right-wingers who will clap like seals at anything that they say, so long as they reinforce their pre-existing political views. You know, we saw this with not just Bill Maher, but also Joe Rogan and Andrew Schulz. All of these so-called comedians are former liberals who switched teams recently and jumped on the Trump train. And I want to talk about all three of them because they misread the room, apparently, and rode the current wave a little bit too hard, and it's already leading to backlash for them. And hilariously, the guys who are supposed to be doing the roasting are now getting roasted themselves. So let's start with Andrew Schulz. I'll admit that I don't really know much about him aside from the fact that he had Trump on his podcast last year, and he's a Joe Rogan orbiter, and he has a mustache that makes him look like a pedophile. But in a recent episode of Trigonometry, which is the dumbest name for a show ever, he explained why he decided to jump ship and become a Trump supporter. And if this right here doesn't represent vibes-based politics, I don't know what does. Let's watch.
The sides switched so much. You know, when I was younger, like, Democrats were cool. They were getting their dicks sucked in the office. They were like, right? They were like supportive of like hip hop music. They said, do whatever you want. Like, we don't want to be in your bedroom. They were cool with gay people. Like, it was cool to be a Democrat. Now, conservatives got 3 baby mamas. The president got 3 baby mamas. He's getting pussy left and right. Right? He's cool. He's the one saying, say whatever the fuck you want. So now conservatives have become Democrats. So I don't think I've changed. I just like the dudes that get pussy and say whatever they want. So it's you want me to be a Democrat again? Get some pussy. Tell me to say whatever I want. I'm there.
Yeah. So I'm not really sure how to respond to that, aside from just saying, wow. I almost feel incapacitated by his stupidity. Like, I lost IQ points hearing him speak. And I had to look up how old he was. And this man is 41 years old. This is a middle-aged man whose politics is probably less mature than a junior high schooler's. I mean, this is why the rest of the world thinks that we're dumbasses in America, because that's somebody who we apparently look up to. I genuinely think that somebody who was literally lobotomized could form a more cohesive political view than that dumbass. What are you supposed to say about this? I mean, I don't know if this is the average American, but they're not too far off, given the results of the last election, right? I'm going to vote based on the president that's getting pussy. Makes sense to me. The fuck? But I mean, this is the kind of shit that happens when you don't know shit, yet you feel inclined to weigh in on politics. And this is somebody who interviewed the president last year. Folks, we are fucking doomed as a country. And I love how he feels like he can say whatever he wants again because the right has popularized the use of slurs once again. That's enough for him. That's enough to say, well, we're back, baby. We can say whatever we want. Never mind the fact that Trump's FCC is threatening to penalize news networks critical of him. Never mind the fact that students like Rumisa Ozturk have been arrested and subsequently denied bond because she co-wrote an op-ed urging her school to follow student resolutions to acknowledge the Palestinian genocide and divest from companies tied to Israel. That's why she was detained, but free speech is back, baby. Never mind the fact that Mahmoud Khalil, a permanent resident, just missed the birth of his son because he's been detained for more than a month over his peaceful participation in Colombia's anti-genocide protests. There's also Masen Madawi, another Colombia protester who was on the cusp of becoming a citizen until he was detained by ICE because he participated in Colombia's anti-genocide protests as well. And while these state-sanctioned kidnappings take place, the State Department is talking about how they're championing and protecting freedom of speech. So we're living in a version of George Orwell's 1984, but free speech is alive and well because Andrew Schulz feels like he won't get much pushback if he uses slurs, I guess. I'm voting for the giant asteroid in 2028. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, it doesn't matter that Trump is brazenly authoritarian. That brazen authoritarianism is okay because he thinks that Trump, a stupid, sweaty slob who pays for pussy, is cool. So everything is fine now. That's how he's going to base his politics on who gets pussy. We have truly surpassed idiocracy levels of stupid in this country, and I get that it's a cliche to bring that up at this point, but it's so true. Now, thankfully, we don't have to feel like we're crazy listening to this troglodyte because people online reacted the same way, and they were not kind to this man. For example, this person writes, 41 years old, and his politics center around who's getting pussy and saying cool shit. What a loser. By the way, this comment had more than 100,000 likes on Twitter of all places. So when the Nazi platform agrees with you that somebody has gone too far in their stupidity, you know that's a sign that society is starting to change again. This person says, this is not a person who is interested in actual politics, lol. His worldview is derived from an early 2000s airbrushed t-shirt of SpongeBob SquarePants holding a stack of money. This must hit so hard if you don't know anything about anything. He's basically a child who never grew up, who idolizes adults that act like irresponsible children. Then he advocates for these people to be in charge of the rest of us. Absolute fucking loser. We need tariffs on podcast equipment. And as a podcaster myself, I second that last comment. But I mean, that was just a small sample of the people shitting on him, because there was a lot of people, basically the entire internet was dunking on him. And ironically, people use the slurs that he seemingly thinks it's okay to use again to describe him for what he said there. So, you know, what goes around comes around, you know, but I'm happy that he was roasted for this, and I genuinely hope that he sees the comments of people making fun of him and he feels bad about himself, because he deserves that. And the fact that that kind of stupidity is already being ridiculed shows us that the vibe is already starting to shift again, which is your sign to all of the wave riders that, you know, it's time to go woke again, friends. Now, speaking of vibe shifts, Joe Rogan, who leaned into the hard right, he recently realized that he's not really liking what he signed up for, and to his credit, he denounced Donald Trump's destruction of the Constitution, although he did so without naming Donald Trump, of course, because why do that? Nonetheless, let's listen.
The problem with things that are going in a radical direction, and then there's an overcorrection. So the overcorrection is lack of due process. The overcorrection is like round them all up, ship them to jail. Like, that's like some things that you say when you're not thinking things through. Like, what do you do about all the criminals? Take them all, fucking send them to El Salvador.
Yeah.
What about due process? No, fuck that. But here's the problem with fuck that. What if you are an enemy of, let's not say any current president. Let's pretend we got a new president, totally new guy in 2028. And this is a common practice now of just rounding up gang members with no due process and shipping them to El Salvador. You're a gang member. No, I'm not. Prove it. What? I got to go to court. No,
Yeah.
no due process.
That's
Right?
dangerous, Joe.
That's dangerous.
dangerous.
That's
man.
dangerous. That's dangerous. We got to be careful that we don't become monsters while we're fighting monsters. I think due process exists for a reason, and the reason is it is horrific for someone to be accused of something they didn't do, be imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit, and then live in a cell, live in a cage with a bunch of
people who did commit shit.
Here it is, Benjamin Franklin. It's better 100 guilty persons should escape than one innocent person should suffer. That is wisdom that has survived hundreds of years. It's incredibly accurate, and it is the foundation of freedom. Like, we have to make sure that these people are actually guilty, otherwise we become monsters.
I wholeheartedly agree. The problem is that when Trump was running on mass deportations, many of us warned you this would happen, but you didn't listen. You called us hysterical and claimed that we were just lying about Donald Trump because we were woke or some bullshit. Listen, it was obvious to anybody with functioning brain cells that you can't round up millions of people without gross violations of their human rights and civil liberties. And it's not like Trump didn't broadcast his intent to go after innocent people, because he did. He did this on the campaign trail. But I mean, the question is, why would anybody roast Joe Rogan for that good take? And the answer is because even though he knows what Trump is doing is wrong, it's embarrassing that he still lacks the conviction and the spine to call him out by name. You don't have to bring up a hypothetical president in the future to describe a situation that might happen when it's already happening right now and it's not hypothetical. And former fans who dominate his subreddit now, by the way, but now hate him, pointed this out, and they also joked about how jarring it was to see Joe Rogan, of all people, make sense again. Spinelessness aside, this person asks, is this AI? Because this makes sense. I can almost hear the old Joe Rogan in this clip. He may still be in there somewhere. He was literally slobbering over Trump a week ago after Trump had already ignored the courts with regard to due process and talked about deporting U.S. citizens to a foreign gulag. And Joe will always base his morals on which way it flows. Exactly. People are outraged about the deportations now, so he is too. Except he's still not calling out the admin. Quote, let's not say any current president is a sentence that came out of his mouth. Let's imagine a scenario where this happens in 2028 under another president instead of calling out the one currently doing it. What a spineless piece of shit. And listen, good on all of his former fans for calling him out, because you don't get to cowardly condemn a situation that you helped to create without naming names. You platform this president and his running mate and let him spew lies on your program with no fucking pushback. Not to mention, you've been licking his boots ever since then and chumming it up with him at Mar-a-Lago. So one singular rant about due process isn't going to undo the harm that you helped to cause, Joe. But, you know, he's very clearly realizing that he rode the Trump wave a little bit too hard, whereas other comedians like Bill Maher seemingly don't think that they rode it hard enough. And I say this because months after the pro-Trump trend already started to fizzle out and reverse, Bill Maher decided to hop on Trump's lap to ride his dick after everybody else was starting to get off. And even though he claims to have many disagreements with Donald Trump, he also has a lot of agreements with Donald Trump. Not to mention, Trump was super duper cordial with him at their private dinner that they had a couple of weeks ago.
There's got to be a better way of running this country than hating each other every minute. I'd never seen him laugh in public, but he does, including at himself. And it's not fake. Believe me, as a comedian of 40 years, I know a fake laugh when I hear it. At one point, we were walking through his amazing tour of the whole house. And I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but it must have been something with the 2020 election, because I know he used the word lost. And I distinctly remember saying, wow, I never thought I'd hear you say that. He didn't get mad. He's much more self-aware than he lets on in public. Look, I get it. It doesn't matter who he is at a private dinner with a comedian. It matters who he is on the world stage. I'm just taking as a positive that this person exists, because everything I've ever not liked about him was, I swear to God, absent, at least on this night with this guy.
Now, he goes on and on and on and continues to glaze up Trump for around 12 minutes or so, saying that he agrees with him on some issues like ethnic cleansing in Gaza and transphobia and DEI going too far, but he was also able to vocalize his criticisms. For example, he didn't think that Trump should have withdrawn from the Iran nuclear agreement, and Trump didn't get mad. How merciful of him. You know, although he didn't bring up the destruction of the Constitution and due process and the people getting disappeared, although he was sure to tell the audience that he didn't agree with those things. So, you know, they know he definitely hasn't sold out because he has some disagreements, even though he didn't choose to vocalize them when he had the ear of the president, the person who's doing these things. But to his credit, he did apparently confront Donald Trump about his plan to run for a third term. And here's how that went.
I'm not going to pull my punches that presidents get to propose a third term for themselves. He understood that, and without animus. That doesn't mean he's not going to try to do it. At one point, I said to him, "You're scaring people. Do you really want to be scaring your own citizens so much?" And I know now you're all saying, "And what did he say to that?" Honestly, I don't remember.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks for telling us. I'm sure that whatever he told you, it was very reassuring. You know, it's not like since you had that dinner with him, he hasn't threatened to deport citizens, homegrowns, to a gulag in El Salvador. So I'm sure that whatever he said put your mind at ease. Listen, Bill Maher already admitted in that first clip that we watched that it doesn't matter what Trump said or who he was at that dinner. What matters is who he is on the world stage. And I agree. But even though Bill Maher said this, presumably to feign self-awareness, I don't think he actually internalized what that meant, because you heavily implied, Bill, that it was beneficial, that somewhere deep down within him, there's a nice person that exists. That doesn't matter. That is completely and utterly irrelevant. And the only reason why you think it matters is because he made you feel special. He wined and dined you and gave you a tour of the White House. And since you suffer from one of the worst cases of main character syndrome that I've ever seen, you know, that was enough to make you feel a little bit better, because at least you're special, right? You know, you're not going to get disappeared to a dungeon in El Salvador for criticizing him. Sure, everybody else may not be rich or privileged enough to meet with the president, but since Bill can, everything's copacetic in the country, apparently. And Bill is too self-centered to realize that he was being used by Trump for propaganda purposes. I mean, sure, he might go after him from time to time and express his disagreements, but now he'll always have a reminder of that pleasant time he had with him in his mind. You know, now I could show you the comments of people shitting on this smug narcissistic prick, but some comedians actually chose to step up and do that job for the rest of us, like Larry David, who wrote a satirical guest essay in the New York Times mocking Bill Maher's dinner with Trump in a piece called My Dinner with Adolf, where he writes, "Imagine my surprise when in the spring of 1939, a letter arrived at my house inviting me to dinner at the old chancellery with the world's most reviled man, Adolf Hitler. I had been a vocal critic of his on the radio from the beginning, pretty much predicting everything he was going to do on the road to dictatorship. No one I knew encouraged me to go. He's Hitler, he's a monster, but eventually I concluded that hate gets us nowhere. I knew I couldn't change his views, but we need to talk to the other side, even if it has invaded and annexed other countries and committed unspeakable crimes against humanity." This sounds like Cenk Uygur too, by the way. He continues, "He was wearing a tan suit with a swastika armband and gave me an enthusiastic greeting that caught me off guard. Frankly, it was a warmer greeting than I normally get from my parents, and it was accompanied by a slap on my back. I found the whole thing quite disarming. I joked that I was surprised to see him in a tan suit because if he wore that out, it would be perceived as unfear-like. That amused him to no end, and I realized I'd never seen him laugh before. Suddenly, he seemed so human. Here I was, prepared to meet Hitler, the one I'd seen and heard, the public Hitler, but this private Hitler was a completely different animal, and oddly enough, this one seemed more authentic, like this was the real Hitler. The whole thing had my head spinning. But it wasn't just a one-way street, with the fear dominating the conversation. He was quite inquisitive and asked me a lot of questions about myself. I told him I had just gone through a brutal breakup with my girlfriend because every time I went someplace without her, she was always insistent that I tell her everything I talked about. I can't stand having to remember every detail of every conversation. Hitler said he could relate. He hated that too. 2 hours later, the dinner was over and the Fuhrer escorted me to the door. I'm so glad to have met you. I hope I'm no longer the monster you thought I was. I must say, mein Fuhrer, I'm so thankful I came. Although we disagree on many issues, it doesn't mean that we have to hate each other. And with that, I gave him a Nazi salute and walked out into the night." Damn. Now, I am sure that Bill Maher is going to have something to say about that. I'm sure he'll accuse Larry David of going woke or being hysterical or some bullshit like that since he compared Trump to Hitler. But this analogy makes sense. And the point is that it doesn't matter that somebody had a pleasant interpersonal relationship with a dictator. It doesn't matter whether or not any brutal dictator or genocidal war criminal is pleasant to be around or a good friend or a good father. But by highlighting the human side of a monster, you become a tool of the monsters. You become a part of the machine that's chewing people up and spitting them out. Trump would never humanize his victims in the way that Bill Maher humanized him. Till this day, the administration continues to call a wrongly deported man an MS-13 gang member when that's factually incorrect. So by using your platform to soften his image, you effectively become what you hated, Bill, which is a fascist. You know, as the saying goes, if there's a Nazi sitting at the dinner table with 10 other people, you have 11 Nazis at the table. But Larry David is not the only comedian to roast Bill Maher, because Hugh Fink of Saturday Night Live wrote an op-ed for The Hill, and he took a different approach. Quote, "There's a maxim that the difference between a comedian and a comic is that a comedian says funny things and a comic says things funny. Then there are clowns like Bill Maher. He traded his red nose for a big brown one the second he eagerly walked into President Donald Trump's gaudy white funhouse of deception. Maher, the comic who once fancied himself as a fearless political truth teller, is now wobbling under the weight of his own ego. His recent televised monologue, an extended love letter to his dinner with Trump, was less a political reflection than a highlight reel of self-flattery and unearned gravitas. In the end, Maher wasn't just played by Trump, he allowed himself to get strung up like a marionette, tossing out softball observations in exchange for the illusion of relevance. Maybe he wanted to be the courageous centrist who tames the beast. Instead, he was the rubber-nosed fool dancing for a Big Mac at the end of Trump's table. But in all fairness to Bill Maher, the vibes were probably so good at the table there. And it's not like Democrats that he supported for years ever bothered to invite him to the White House, and he is entitled to a visit. Not us, but since he's important, since he's Bill Maher, he is entitled to a visit. So since somebody finally invited him to the visit that he's been entitled to, what are you going to do? You got to accept, right? Listen, the fact that these comedians are already being ruthlessly roasted for their vibes-based bullshit politics, that right there is your indication that there's another cultural shift already underway just months into the second Trump term. Didn't take long, did it? See, in January, it felt like MAGA was on top of the world, and by April, they're already the laughingstock of the world again, and the people who hopped on the bandwagon because of the vibe shift already look like vapid fucking idiots. So I guess the moral of the story is to have an actual belief system that doesn't change with the direction of the wind. Believe in something, learn about the root causes of political problems in this country, and build upon that. I'll give you a starting place. Capitalism. You're not broke because of immigrants and trans people or wokeness. You're broke because oligarchs paid politicians to rig the economy against you. And they're getting richer at your expense. And whenever you start to uncover the truth about this, they brainwash you again into thinking that somebody else is the real problem. Somebody else, usually with no money and no power, they're the reason why you're broke, not them. You'll never understand why things are so bad if you don't challenge yourself to understand the root causes of our country's problems and how capitalism dehumanizes all of us, and only a select few benefit from this economic system. So don't be a wave rider is what I'm saying, I guess. Otherwise, at some point, you're going to look as foolish as these comedians that we talked about today.
Woke mob. Woke mob.
Woke ideology.
Woke ideology.
Woke ideology.
Woke ideology.
Woke ideology.
Woke test.
Woke ideology.
Woke Olympics.
Woke ideology.
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 Weaponized wokery.
Woke ideology.